Hey everyone, I'm excited to release this conversation that I had with Austin Carty. I'm guessing that maybe most of you are not familiar with Austin, as I wasn't until I found his little book, The Pastor's Bookshelf. But Austin is a fantastic guy, a great conversation partner, and I reached out to him because I adored this book. And I wanted to say that even though it's called The Pastor's Bookshelf, there's a lot of insights in here about reading in general. I would say you could call this the leader's bookshelf. It's like if you are in a position of leadership or influence really in any way, this book is a great exploration of the importance of reading as part of forming wisdom and maturity as a leader. And that's a lot of what we talk about. We talk a lot about, of course, we use this book as a springboard, but we talk about really a defense of reading and the practice of reading and why it's important and the connections between reading and wisdom and why that's important in our cultural moment. And we talk about the importance of reading widely from diverse viewpoints, and we talk about engaging reading that you disagree with in a humble and charitable way. And of course, we talk a lot about the books we're currently reading, what we're thinking about them, what we are enjoying reading right now. So again, Austin is a very warm-hearted person. I had a very enjoyable exchange with him, and I think if you follow and appreciate the work that I do, you're going to really also resonate with his approach to reading and his exploration of why reading is so important today. So without further ado, my conversation with Austin Carty. Welcome to Books and Big Ideas, what I'm reading, what I'm thinking about, with Joel Wentz. All right, so let's start talking about some of your ideas from the Pastor's Bookshelf. I'll put up an image too so that everyone can make sure that they see it, because I do even, I think that I have a decent range of listeners or watchers who may or may not even be Christians, and certainly may or may not be pastors. Regardless, right. I think even though pastor is in the title, I think a lot of people who appreciate what I'm doing, my little corner of the internet, will appreciate your tone and your posture in this book. So I can highly recommend it at the outset. But awesome. There's a couple. Thanks, there's a couple ideas I want to try to mine with you if we can do that. The first one is the whole question about the utility and the practicality of reading. And then we can talk about wide reading. I really want to talk about that with you, because I think we have a lot of resonance on that. But yeah, I would just love to. You talk a lot in the Pastor's Bookshelf about, the pushback people like you and I get about, like, well, how do you use what you're reading, or do you have to always quote what you're reading in sermons, or how do you know it's quote worthwhile to spend this time reading? And I would just love to have you unpack how you respond to that whole idea, that whole approach to reading as you kind of utilitarian. And how do you think about that? And how would you encourage other people to think about that? And how do you respond to that?
It's such an important question, because if one doesn't have the right framing for what reading is for and how it is formative and formational, then that question can produce immense amounts of anxiety and guilt in a pastor. Because you feel like you need to be able to show right away what is the instrumental value of what you're doing. And I think that's because we just live in such a transactional and instrumental culture. This extends so far beyond reading. It just then kind of maps onto reading like it does everything else. And it just doesn't work that way when it comes to reading. At least it ought not to work that way.
Right.
Because very seldom is the book that I'm currently reading something that I'm going to be able to immediately use in this week's sermon or this week's study or, this pastoral visit or whatever. I mean, every now and again that might happen, but so seldom. It's instead, I use Fred Craddock's image here. It's like building a reservoir and filling it. And with each book, each article, each essay, each thing that we're reading, we're filling that reservoir. And what ends up then happening is that the utility of all of that reading, where it does in fact have cash value, as it were, is that eventually at some point that reservoir is so full that you are writing your sermon and all of a sudden, unbidden, here comes this image or this quote or this passage where it's exactly what you needed in that moment in a way that
Mm.
you couldn't possibly have shoehorned what you're reading in. You know, Mark Twain has a line where he says the difference between the right word and the wrong word is the difference between lightning and a lightning bug.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, it's similar with quotes that folks like to use, whether they're pastors in sermons or just speakers and presentations. You always know if somebody started with, "Oh, I really like that quote. I want to use it so I sound smart, or so I
Right.
can, you know,
Yeah.
embed this in." It just has this little ring of dissonance.
Mm.
Whereas if it is exactly the thing that is going to illustrate and bring out further richness in the rest of the body of what's being presented or preached, then it just rings true.
Yeah.
And that can
Oh man.
only happen if you've been building the reservoir to where it's there. Because the thing about that is it's there, but you don't even know it.
Mm-hmm. That's so good.
Another another one of the things that surprises me often is that I will read a book and there will be parts that I think are the things that are really going to stay with me. Because when you read, you only remember so much of
Mm-hmm.
what you read, and we can talk about that in a minute. But I'm often surprised by when a book does come back to me months or years later. It's seldom the things I thought would come back. It's
Mm.
something that that just kind of got filtered through that I hadn't thought about in forever. Might not even have made that big of an impact on me when I read it, but it was there in a way I didn't know it. And suddenly it bubbles up to the surface and it's right there when I need it. And
Mm.
I just know from so many other readers, whether they be pastors or practitioners in some other vocation, that this happens for them too, that it is a reality. But
Yeah.
you have to dedicate yourself to doing it. And so to the person who asks, well, what is what is the use of your taking this time to do that? You have to have reframed it in your mind to be able to say, I can't tell you what exactly this book's use is going to be. I just
Yeah.
know that it will ultimately be beneficial in some sphere of my ministry.
That's so good, man. Yeah, I was smirking a minute ago because of the the example you use of cherry picking a quote, or carefully selecting a quote to um appear more intellectually robust or something. And I'm smirking because not only have I seen that happen, but I have done that. I've definitely been on both sides of that scenario, and it always feels a little gross, afterwards. But the thing that strikes me that connects with the reservoir idea as you're talking about it is, I mean, an obvious point is that a reservoir takes time. You have to carve it out, and it takes time to fill. You can really press the analogy, I think. But the other thing that's striking me even now as we're talking about this is, and this struck me as I read your book too, but um, it's hard to articulate, but there's a felt difference between when the pastor or lecturer or someone up there, you can tell that they're skimming a quote. There's a very felt difference between that and when you can tell that they've really soaked in the material.
Yep.
And the funny, I don't know if it's an ironic thing, or the funny thing is that sometimes a pastor, I think of someone like Tim Keller, who is obviously just a deep reader. It just kind of exudes out from him. You can just tell he doesn't even need to quote Nietzsche. He doesn't even need to quote, Charles Taylor. We were talking about Taylor before we recorded, but you can just tell he's spent time in with those thinkers, and it has automatically a deeper level of credibility than the person who skims the quote and puts it on the slide with the picture of the person they're quoting. So I don't really know what I'm getting at there. I guess I'm just kind of resonating with this whole idea of building a reservoir and taking the time to do it. But how does that strike you?
Oh, I think you're 100% right. And Keller's such a good example of that. And it reminds me of something that I once heard Tom Long say. He he said to me that uh that when it comes to writing or preaching, and if you are someone who's had the blessing and the benefit of being able to read a lot and have been able to go through theological training and all of these things, there can then be that temptation
Mm,
to kind of show it in your work, so to speak, you know.
hmm.
And unless you are actually working in the academy, uh, you don't need to do that. And so
Mm,
Tom's image was and this has stuck with me for years. He'd said, uh, people like to feel cool, but they don't want to have the HVAC rumbling right there beside them.
Yeah, that's good.
And and I've always thought that is a really good image for what I hear you getting at. That
Mm-hmm.
you want to know it's there, it's underneath, it's the thing that's making it all, possible, but it doesn't need to be drawing attention to itself either.
Right. That's good.
And the complicated thing about that, as you're pointing out, is that can't just happen. I mean,
Yeah.
you have to have actually done a lot of the reading to be able to get to where you have that kind of facility with it, that it's just so embedded that you don't have to be quoting names. And even, in fact, sometimes you don't even know in the moment
Right. Yep. I've had that
who you're
experience.
pulling from.
Mm-hmm.
It's there
Mm-hmm.
because you've now appropriated it. And
Mm-hmm.
even though it was passed on to you from somewhere else, you now have it so much that it's become kind of the mother tongue,
Mm-hmm.
for you. And
Yeah.
I think that's a great point.
And there's no shortcuts, and there's so much conversation too around things like character, and leadership, character, integrity. There's so many conversations happening in the Christian evangelical world. This really dovetails with all of that, I think. I mean, a lot of what you're talking about in your book, at least the way I received it, was committing to a reading life is committing to your own deep formation. It's not, I hesitate to make it too exclusive. I wouldn't say that someone who, because there are people who just don't read, aren't compelled by it,
Yeah.
aren't drawn to it. Although I would argue that a lot of people read more than, they probably think. They just read it in tiny little snippets on,
Right.
other
Right.
doom scrolling. Anyways, we could set that aside. That's a whole other topic.
Yeah.
I do think not everyone needs to, like, it's not the case that if you don't read, you can't have character, right? I think
Right.
we
Right.
obviously would
Right.
agree on that. But
Right.
man, I thought one of the points you make so well is that reading is a way to be formed really deeply. And it's a characterological issue, or it can be. And yeah, I love that HVAC image too. And what was occurring to me too, even as you're talking, is like, this to me is kind of ironic. I hadn't made this connection before, but there's that maxim, there's that famous phrase of show don't tell in writing,
Yeah.
or in
Yeah.
art in general. But like, it's so funny that sometimes we do exactly the opposite. The
Yeah.
quote picking and throwing quotes and names around, that is the opposite of showing and not telling, which has not occurred to me before. But it's funny
Yeah.
that those
Yeah.
of us who would, supposedly read and write, maybe give into that very temptation in a deeply anxious way to prove something.
Sure.
There's insecurities there too. But yeah, how does that, I don't know, what's your response to that?
Yeah, well, one of the things I love already about this interview, Joel, is your sincerity in naming, like you have done it too. Because the only
Hmm.
way I would know that is because I've done it too.
Sure.
I mean, but I think it's natural. So
Hmm.
while we kind of chuckle and then also say we want to kind of grow beyond this, I think it's part of the movement too. I mean, it just yes, it comes from, I think, a place of insecurity and need to kind of show what you
Yeah.
what you've been doing. But I don't really know that you can leap, from
Yeah.
just kind of beginning to that other stage. I mean, there's
Totally.
something about like wanting the world to know I've been engaging these things. And this is and it is settling into kind of your identity as a thinker, and depending on kind of what role you inhabit vocationally as a leader and all that kind of stuff. So
Yeah.
I think that's perfectly normal, but I also don't think we ought to stay there. I think we need to
Agreed.
grow beyond it.
Yeah.
In the same way that one of the things that I've always been very quick to point out is that the argument in the pastor's bookshelf is that reading will inevitably enrich every sphere of one's ministry,
Mm.
and kind of expanding beyond that. Even though the book is kind of pitched at pastors, it makes the argument for how that is true of all human persons. Whatever your vocation, it just will enrich us as
Hmm.
as human beings. That it will inevitably happen, but that it doesn't follow then that if you don't read, you
Yeah.
can't be a good pastor or a person, of good character, or uh
Hmm.
or or or
Hmm.
a broad person or any of that stuff. It just means it's only going to be further enriched or further broadened if you do. And that
Mm.
reading is among, if not the most enriching and broadening things that we can do.
That's so good. Yeah. Yeah. That strikes a deep chord with me. And hopefully, I call my channel Books and Big Ideas, so presumably readers are going to be watching this, so hopefully it'll resonate with them too. Watchers, you have permission. You have permission
Yeah.
to set aside time. You have permission to sink into books.
Well, I hope that will be a license to feel a little more comfortable doing that, because one
Yeah.
other piece I didn't touch on in that,
Mm,
because you ask about the formative aspect of
yeah.
reading, is that that's not a given to most people. It certainly was never
Mm,
given to me. I mean, one of the things that I hope my book can do is help people who are already given to reading, and certainly then others who aren't already given to reading, a better framework for understanding the benefit of the reading act, because we tend, even as
yeah.
readers, to think of reading as being an informational act, that we read so as to upload information that we then retain so that we can then dispense when the moment arises. And obviously it is that, but if it's only that, then reading can be a very frustrating thing,
That's right.
because unless you're one of the handful of genetic lottery winners who has a photographic memory, the rest of us retain at best 10%
Mm,
of what we read. Studies kind of show that anywhere around kind of 10% is what, the average reader retains. And so that's very frustrating for people who do a lot of reading, that 90% of
yeah.
what you read, you just
Mm,
seemingly gone.
mm,
But the thing is, reading is far more a formational act than it is an informational act, harkening back to all the things that we just
yeah.
said. Like,
That's yeah.
because even if we don't remember all of it, it has gotten inside of us. It has continued to layer the lens through which we see everything around us, through which we interpret reality. It just necessarily does. And so even if we don't have direct access anymore, all of that stuff is still in there. It's still part of the layer of the lens that we see the world through. And that's an important thing for understanding about our reading and for giving us a greater sense of permission to do it. If
Yeah.
we aren't remembering everything, that isn't code for I could be using my time more wisely.
That's so good. Yeah.
The question is rather, am I experiencing myself becoming a more enriched and nuanced person
Mm-hmm.
on account of how much I'm reading? And the
Mm-hmm.
answer, if we really are reading, is always going to be yes, with the one caveat that we have to be reading from a disposition of charity and humility.
Mm,
Um, um, that's necessary, because if we go into our reading to already just kind of prove what we already think,
yeah.
or to be cynical about something that we know that we are already against, um it's not necessarily going to develop us from a character standpoint. It might give us some more information, um but it's not going to kind of refine our sense of character and our ability to speak wisely, and knowingly and graciously on any manner of topics. That's what a really well balanced reading diet can do if we approach it
Mm,
with a spirit of humility. It breeds wisdom, which is not the same as being informed
that's
or
so
knowing
true.
something.
So
And
true.
it gives us a heightened capacity for being able to deal unanxiously with any manner of conversation, and graciously and charitably.
Man, you said so much that I love there. And especially in the pastoral vocation today, as we record this in late 2022, I don't need to belabor the point about polarization and toxic politics and all that stuff. We're right after the midterms. We don't know who's controlling the Senate right now. All this
Right.
stuff is just maybe going to be par for the course for some time. Um, but everything you're talking about is getting at so many aspects of how a life of reading can uniquely equip not just a pastor, but I think any leader, any
Yeah.
wise leader of people, or someone in the center of a community of people that's going to intersect with these divisive cultural issues. A commitment and a discipline to wide reading and humble reading. I love that point. The spirit, the posture with which you engage the reader. Oh man, yeah. There's so many things, so many places I want to go with this, because it's funny how at the same time a wide reading life can equip you to wisely lead people in these divided times. Reading is also the thing that arguably a certain type of reading is fueling polarization too, like the reading without the humble spirit you're talking about. So it's really entangled in all of these issues. And this is actually a perfect kind of pivot to the next thing I wanted to talk about, which was wide reading. You talk really eloquently in your book about really committing to wide sources from different perspectives, politically, globally, all that stuff. And I would love to talk about that a little bit with you, and how to find, how do I diagnose if you're maybe not reading widely, or what that could look like, where to go from there. Yeah. So let's go there. I have an anecdote I might share about my own kind of journey on this, but I'd love to hear you respond to that first.
Yeah, there's so much in there, so many
Uh-huh.
great insights and great questions. I'll start in one spot and run and see where I land.
Sounds good.
Um, one of the things that struck me while you're talking about that is, in a wide balanced reading diet, which I think is so pivotal for the cultivation of wisdom. Again, as over against information and knowledge, but wisdom. Um, Craig Barnes in two different books, both in Pastor's Minor Poet and also
Oh
in
yeah.
Diary of a Pastor's Soul, refers to a certain capacity that some, he's writing about ministers, but again, this is true of leaders. But that some ministers have of gravitas, a,
Mm.
a, a kind of weight of the soul that has an attractional pull to it. And I think of that because when you talk about living in polarized, divisive times, um, where not only are things polarized and divisive, but the ideological tailwinds just kind of shift and move and push in
Mm-hmm.
different directions, and you got folks chasing one thing one day, and then the next we're chasing and yelling about this and that, and most of the folks we're leading are living in that world and are in some ways either caught up in, or all of us are of course affected by it. But I think that in such a culture where that is so pervasive, folks are drawn even more magnetically to
Mm.
the few folks who have that gravitas that
Mm-hmm.
Barnes talks about. And so for the pastors, I feel like, who can deal unanxiously with the moment we're living in, and be able to sit down and listen sincerely and speak knowledgeably and respond graciously to folks who are in different places and being affected by the present moment in different ways. I think for a number of people, that is like a cool drink of
Mm-hmm.
parched folks in the desert.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so it's not going to be the thing that's going to make, if you're a pastor, your pews swell with folks. You
Right.
know, it red meat's what's going to do that. You know, I mean, it
Yeah.
always is. But for the folks that are just hungering for that,
Mm-hmm.
it's so apparent. I know that it is for me when I see it.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Me too.
and and reading is not the only way that you can be a person who projects that to the world, but it certainly, in my view, is one of the foremost ways to cultivate it.
Yeah.
And so I think that's one of the real benefits for folks that are leaders to read, and certainly pastors, is that in this present moment,
Yeah.
it does enrich and cultivate and make possible that sense of gravitas. That
So
that is,
good.
it's wisdom, but it's even more than wisdom. It's wisdom and poise.
It's so
Um,
inspiring, because it's also, basically what I hear you saying is it's kind of the precise thing that's lacking, and so we have an opportunity to develop it, through reading, and in that way strike a deep, what's that Frederick Buechner quote, the world's deep need,
yeah,
um,
yeah, yeah.
we have an opportunity there, is what I hear you saying. It's actually really, really inspiring and encouraging. You were going to say
Yeah,
something else.
yeah. Well, it just off of what you said, it made me think that yes, because it exposes what the world is lacking, and because we realize it's what the world is lacking, it becomes so obvious to
Hmm.
folks who recognize the lack and realize the need. You
That's
know what I
right.
mean? Like,
Yep, I do.
whereas in a moment when it might not be so desperately lacking, it might not be so readily noticeable
Yeah.
when someone is actually kind of inhabiting the vocation in that way.
Yeah, that's how it hits me. Well, let's talk about this a little bit, even maybe some personal examples. So
Yeah.
I mentioned in my email to you, I might bring up Thomas Sowell at this point.
Yes. Yep. Yep. Yep.
So I resisted, I just in kind of the circles I operate in, I largely in more left of center politically kind of social world that I'm in. Um, and so my exposure to Thomas Sowell was pretty much only sound bites and memes and clips from people who were trying to own the libs, you know.
Yeah. Yep. Yep.
So
Yep. Yep.
so so Thomas Sowell was this almost this kind of an empty signifier for a while for me of like, oh well, that's the person, that's the academic that all the super conservative, libertarians leverage to, whatever, to make their arguments. And so all that to say, I just resisted. I was like, this Thomas Sowell guy, I have a bad taste in my mouth about this guy, right?
Yep.
And so I
Yep.
resisted for a long time in direct, opposition to what we're talking about with wide reading. For a long time, I resisted reading him because of that kind of exposure. And you can talk about whether that was legitimate or not. It was fueled by social media and all that stuff. That's true. However, at some point, I don't remember exactly what sparked it, but I finally picked up a Thomas Sowell book several years ago. I picked up his little book, Intellectuals and Race, and it kicked open a door in my brain. And I loved the book. And I think that at times I've gone and read a bunch of his stuff. I think sometimes he overstates his stuff. I'm not as libertarian as he is, all of those
Yep.
caveats.
Yep. Yep.
But I genuinely am in a position where I love Thomas Sowell's books. I think they're so helpful, and I can say to any extent I've developed any wisdom in some of the things he talks about, it's because of reading him and then finding other thinkers that are more in that sphere that I wouldn't have been exposed to otherwise, and balancing those things out with the other thinkers that I had already been reading. You can start to sense a much deeper confidence in some of these topics, and when it comes to social sciences, especially in this case. So that was my experience with Thomas Sowell. That was one that it surprised me in the best possible way. And I have a bunch of his books on my shelf now, and I'm a big fan. So I'm curious what that sparks for you. If you have a personal example of a thinker or a writer like that surprised you, or how do you cultivate wide reading in your own life?
Both great questions. I think the way that you referred to soul as an empty signifier in kind of our present
Yeah.
internet meme own one another culture is a perfect way of putting that. And he's a great example of that. And I couldn't agree more. Um, and a similar experience for me, not in that I now love her and read a lot from her and necessarily have even fully benefited from, but Ayn Rand is also one that
Mm.
is often used, I think, as
Yeah.
an empty signifier.
Yeah.
Uh, other way around. And uh, I had never read, either of Ayn Rand's kind of big books, and God, I guess it was probably about um 7 years ago, 8 years ago now, I said, you know what, I'm going to read Atlas Shrugged.
Mm.
You know, and similarly, I came to it, anticipating,
Yeah.
why this was going to be everything wrong with the world,
Right.
and and I didn't close the book having said, wow, I am now one who is a big
Right.
Ayn Rand fan. I agree wholeheartedly with the in my view, very just criticism that one, it presents a way too individualized look at what it means to be
Yeah.
human. There's no place in there for humility, I don't think. I just it doesn't track for me with a Pauline understanding of what it
Sure.
means
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
to be human, and certainly in my view with a Jesus centered approach. But be all that as it may, um, I found that book to be very useful for a few reasons. And one of those is that to this day, when I see folks shirking, not wanting to be responsible for something,
Mm,
wanting to be able, not wanting to be the one to just make a decision and wanting to, and wanting to be able to kind of push that off and kind of form, groups or bureaucracies or something to be able, and this is something that happens when you're in leadership. You realize why that happens so much.
mm-hmm.
And that was one of the things that really came through strongly for me in Atlas Shrugged. And therefore that is a book that has stuck with me in a way that I wouldn't have thought that it was going to.
Sure.
And
Can
I
totally see that.
realized as I was reading it and telling some other folks I was reading it and had posted at the time. Back then I used to post a little bit more on social media in general, but Facebook in particular, about what I was reading. Um and it was always interesting to see who would kind of weigh in on what I was
Right.
reading. But when I did that, all of the folks that that I'm friendly with on there that are left of center were just trashing the book and
Mm-hmm.
trashing her. And I remember thinking, I don't believe all of y'all have read this book. I mean, this
Yeah.
is a 1,200-page book. I just don't think it's and
Yeah.
so despite whether any of the criticisms in the end were warranted or not, to go back to you talking about being an empty signifier,
Yeah.
I do think that when we get some of these names that we kind of attach to kind of our
Mm-hmm.
own ideological take on the world, you know, perhaps we ought to have some real familiarity with
Yeah,
what we're talking about, and not even just having read like a couple paragraphs, like
that's right.
really kind of track the argument. And
Mm-hmm.
then, because usually it's a lot more nuanced and usually there's a lot more to take away
Yep.
uh than we might have realized going in. And that's just an example that immediately comes to mind.
Mm-hmm.
I there's so many like that.
Oh yeah.
um I remember in Eugene Peterson's book, the Pastor, which that is certainly not somebody I've ever gone into, thinking that I'm reading against the grain. I mean,
Yeah.
I call Peterson in my book the pastor reader par excellence.
Oh
But
yeah, he's one of my heroes too.
yeah. But he talks about, having some folks, if I remember right, it's in the Pastor, either read, or he's talking about, or he reads from um Harry Emerson Fosdick. And
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
it's a more conservatively
Yep.
leaning group, and they're moved by what they're hearing. And then when they find out that it's Fosdick, they're like, wait,
Yep.
and
Mm-hmm.
so,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's a little older reference now, but that's another one of those that in kind of theological circles, I feel like can be an empty signifier for
Mm-hmm.
working,
Mm-hmm.
back the other way.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that's true wherever we kind of feel like
Yeah.
we're positioned. If we just can go charitably to read, we'll find that most of these people that have gotten a lot of play, it's not necessarily because they were all yelling so loud and so mean spiritedly that they attracted an audience. It's actually because there was some substance to a lot of what they were saying.
Mm-hmm.
And those things, if we are charitable and open and honest and really do want to grow, I think we can always find that those things massage and 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 um and help kind of refine where we are. It doesn't mean that we're going to move ourselves over to where somebody else
Yeah.
is, but it probably means that we're going to be able to look a lot more graciously
Yeah.
at everybody else.
That's so true. I think it would actually be fun to just keep doing examples of this, like writers and thinkers
Yeah.
surprises. But another one that comes to mind for me is Nietzsche. The circles I grew up in, just all I knew about Nietzsche was he was the God is dead guy, right? And kind of the source of all evil, everything that's wrong with culture. I have and continue to benefit greatly from reading Nietzsche's writings. There's something about the fiery honesty in his. I mean, I would say it's prophetic. There's some prophetic edge to some of what he talks about when he diagnoses what's going on in culture. And of course, we have radically different metaphysical commitments and ideas. But man, oh man, So beneficial. It can be so beneficial. And I think, it just brings me back to, it actually reminds me of where we started this conversation, which is the idea of you can tell when someone is quoting something and they haven't actually,
Yeah,
developed
yeah.
that muscle of interacting with it. Just like how you can tell when a pastor's doing that up front, you can tell when someone's posting about it on social media and they haven't actually interacted with it. And if you
Well,
can't, if you can't articulate, like if you're coming up against an idea and you can't articulate where that idea comes from and how the person got there and how they've traced their argument, it is just this weaponization that happens in our culture that isn't really helping anybody. But what were you going to say?
no, I just wanted to affirm everything you were saying. I mean, I love the example that you've given. I mean, because I came up Nietzsche. That's how all I knew of or had heard
Yeah.
of Nietzsche myself. But even to connect it to what I was saying about Ayn Rand and what I'd taken
Mm-hmm.
from all of that myself. Um, for many of the folks who are big devotees, one of the things that has to be engaged with is its preoccupation with power and its, as I
Mm-hmm.
was saying, the place where humility really has no place in
Mm.
that philosophy. But
Yeah.
you then need to be able to track that back to someone like Nietzsche and the whole idea of the transvaluation of values, and be able to actually look at and take him on his terms and say, let's not just criticize and reject what this man is saying. Let's look at how deeply insightful and trenchant this is.
Yes.
When he says that what the Christian religion does is it takes the things that really are laudable, power, esteem, all of these things, and inverts them and tricks people into saying, no, we need to be humble and
Right.
self-sacrificial. And
Mm-hmm.
because otherwise we have this cognitive dissonance where we have this Christian language game where we say these things like humility and self-sacrifice are important, but really what we esteem powerful because it enables us to see um where there are just deficiencies in either it calls us to see, actually, no, this is right. A naked desire and will to power is what I think life should be about. Or it's to
Right.
say, honestly, I don't see that this celebrates humility in the way that the Gospels and the Pauline epistles tell me that it's supposed to.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but someone like Nietzsche and that kind of an argument, and knowing that it derives from him and actually reading it from his pen, is such an important thing.
Yeah. Oh man. Yeah. And he lays that choice bare. I think that's what I take away from when I interact with it. Like he lays that choice bare in a way that it's actually helpful for it to be that clear, as yeah, for it to be that clearly laid out. So oh man, yeah. Well, I keep talking about Nietzsche, but we're getting near the end of the time that I had set up. So I would love to, well, let's just round out the conversation with just talking about what we're reading and what we're looking forward to reading and stuff that's kind of on our radar. So why don't you throw us a few titles and thinkers out there?
Well, this I guess would be an opportunity for us to plug our joint buddy that we're both fanboys of that we talked about before we were
Yeah.
beginning. Andy Root, who I know you just recently had on. I'm a big fan of Andy Root, and I'm
Mm-hmm.
have just finished his fifth book in the Ministry in a Secular Age book. Wonderful book, Church After Innovation. That's a really really great book.
Mm-hmm.
Um, uh, I've just reread Go Tell It on the Mountain for a
Oh,
podcast that I'm doing with Claude Acho and Jessica
and
Hooton
Jessica.
Wilson.
Yeah.
Yep. Um, and I let's see what
That
did I
podcast, by the
also.
way, I actually intended to mention this. I'm glad you brought it up. It's called The Scandal of Reading. So recommend it for anyone who's interested in podcasts that want to check that out.
Yeah, please. It's an exciting thing,
Mm-hmm.
and Jessica has been very gracious to kind of let Claude and me kind of join into something she already had in the works, and it's a joy and honor to get to do a podcast with both of them because they're both just such great writers and
Mm-hmm.
thinkers. And um, so I am reading uh I'm trying to think of what novel I have most recently read. I
Yeah, we
read
didn't really
a
talk about
book.
fiction very much, but oh man,
Yeah,
that's a whole other
and
thing.
yeah, and I mean the thing is, I often spend most of my time trying to encourage people to read fiction because,
Mhm.
I feel like reading fiction forms us at what James K. Smith calls these subterranean levels.
Yeah.
To where it's just a different kind of knowing, but it's a deeper, more kind of entrenched, embedded way of knowing. But I just read the book A Little Life that came out 5 or 6 years ago now. It had gotten a whole lot of critical acclaim. Hanya, I can't pronounce the last name, but long book, tough book, but very powerful book. So just read it, and even though this happens to me every podcast I go on to talk about my book.
Yeah.
And I regularly say that, and I, as a reader, I'm curious whether this will resonate with you, Joel, but I've often thought that I can tell a real reader by when I ask, "What are you reading lately?" and they get really anxious. Like instead of a deer in headlights look, it's like an anxiousness because there's so much they've been
Yeah.
reading that
Yeah.
it's like, oh, somebody finally asked me.
Yeah.
But then
Yeah.
like you can't grab all the
Yeah.
things that have been going on it's that versus somebody who has a really ready pat answer at hand.
Yeah.
There's
Yeah.
a deer in headlights look, or there's like a pat answer in hand,
Yeah.
but then if you drill down a little deeper,
It's so true.
so if you once you tell me what you're reading, another
Yeah.
few will probably come to my mind, but
Mhm.
but those are the ones here most recent.
That's great. No, that's great. I had heard of A Little Life and I had forgotten about it until you mentioned that. So I was just looking it up. So yeah, I am working through, I've got a few things as usual, but I'm working through John Meacham's new Abraham Lincoln biography
Yeah,
called And There Was a Light. I've been a
yeah,
fan of Meacham for some time, and I've especially enjoyed his biographies of Jefferson and Jackson.
me too.
So so this it's really good. I mean, if you like him, you're gonna like this book. It's more of his take, but I will say he foregrounds um, Abraham Lincoln's relationship to slavery and the scientific racism of the time. He foregrounds it in this biography. Obviously, he's responding to the cultural kind of moment we're in and the conversation there, but I will say he brings just a depth of research and nuance to really trying to paint a portrait of Lincoln, a good portrait of Lincoln, and he gets into some of his Lincoln's religious commitments are difficult to pin down on any personal level, but he gets into some of what may have formed him as a child, which is fascinating. Some of the really anti-slavery religious impulses that he may have been around as a child. So, anyways, I would definitely, for history buffs, recommend Meacham's new biography quite a bit. And then one other nonfiction one that I just started is called Can't Even. Have you heard of this book?
I
It's
have not.
it's by a journalist. It's kind of I tend to like books by journalists. I think they're enjoyable to read so she's pulling together a lot. I just started it, so I'm barely at the beginning, but she's pulling together a lot of social research on millennial burnout. So the subtitle is something about and I'm an older millennial, I'm 36, so I'm like right in there. She's talking about how basically the wider systemic and social structural issues that have contributed to such wide burnout in my generation. So it's hitting me. I can tell just in the opening pages, it's hitting me at a pretty deep level. So I'm excited to see the argument she brings to it. But yeah, that's called Can't Even. So I don't know what else is on
I'll
your.
have to check that out. No,
Yeah.
that sounds good. Well, so I was remembering as you were talking,
Yeah.
I went and reread a large bit of Isaiah Berlin's The Roots of Romanticism and
Oh, I've not read that.
selected essays and selected essays. And so Isaiah Berlin was Charles Taylor's dissertation advisor.
Mm-hmm.
I'm pretty certain of that.
Yeah, I think that's right.
But yeah, you can fact check me on that. But as somebody who deeply appreciates Charles Taylor and obviously we talked about Andy Root, somebody who just kind of appreciates the history of ideas and intellectual history and kind of doing philosophical genealogies. I went and I've had something kind of animating a desire in me to reread certain things, and that's one of them. And then
Mm.
also right around that same time, a couple weeks ago, I read selected essays in one of his essay collections called "The Crooked Timber of Humanity." So those are
Mm.
things I've recently read too.
That's great. I'd actually love to know where. So Berlin is a cultural theorist I've been interested in for a long time, but I haven't actually dipped into his work. Is there a good entry point? Would you say one of those is better than the others?
Well, so I think that essay collection, "The Crooked Timber of Humanity," is a really good place to start.
Mm.
Not in that collection or which collection it's in, but his essay on the two liberties,
Mm.
where kind of famously negative liberty versus positive liberty are put forward. Um, it's I think it's one of the kind of most important and illuminating essays and ideas that one could read right now.
Mm.
But I can't point you to which collection that one's in. I forget. It's not in the Crooked Timber of Humanity.
Got it.
But that would be a good place to start. And the roots of Romanticism is not. It's not a pleasure read, but it's also a very enlightening read. And you can get in some of those essay collections a distillation of the longer argument of the roots of Romanticism. But if you like what you see in some of the essays, the first book I'd point to, not that I'm a scholar on this at all, but I'd point to the roots of Romanticism.
Great. That's helpful. Awesome. Well, let's just end by talking briefly about some fiction we enjoy. I just finished recently just finished Stephen King's newest. I'm a pretty huge Stephen King fan. Actually, and he writes books frequently enough. You can pretty much always be reading a new one. But his last one's called Fairy Tale.
Yeah.
I just finished that one, and I will say it's not my favorite King, but it's good. I mean, he's, in my opinion, a decent King is better than most novels that are out there. And I will say it's not, if you for anyone who maybe is quasi interested in King but doesn't like horror, Fairy Tale might be a good one because it's not, not into the some of his classic horror kind of tropes, but it was good. What about you? Any like fiction shout outs you want to make before we wrap up?
Well, yeah. I'm often asked like what fiction I'd recommend, somebody go read, and that's another way of saying what fiction do you really like?
Yeah, right.
So, kind of my usual go-tos. So Marilyn Robinson is,
of course.
Gilead was pivotal for me. It's an obvious answer in many ways for a reading pastor to give, but nonetheless, it's important in my autobiography, and I always recommend all of her novels.
I haven't read Jack yet. Have you read Jack?
Yes, and it pains me to say that I didn't love it as much as I loved the other three. Now, other people have argued with me on that, and I'm very open to being persuaded. I would love to be persuaded. I didn't love it as much as I loved the other three. Though there were exquisite parts in there.
Yeah,
always,
I'm sure.
But I enjoyed the first three more than I enjoyed Jack.
I loved Lila. I think
it's gorgeous.
Might have been my favorite, but
yeah, we read as we have 3-person ministerial staff at my church, and we read books together regularly, and we read all of those books together. And my favorite will always be Gilead because of what it meant to me when I had first read it. But the other two both liked Home the most. I mean, so that just goes to show how great they are. You touch on Lila, I say Gilead.
Yeah.
And all of us would say yes, absolutely.
Right. Yeah, you could see it. You can see how anyone could.
When somebody tells me Jack, I can't see it. But that does in no way my love and appreciation for Marilyn Robinson.
Yeah, she's wonderful.
I really like Jonathan Franzen. He's one of the ones that when a new Jonathan Franzen book comes out, I go get it.
Have you read Crossroads?
I have. Yeah. And we could do a whole conversation on that.
Yeah, we can.
I won't even begin because I'm like a wind-up toy. But I do want to name these other three, and then I'll quit. But I think that Yagyasi, if you've
Mm,
read Homegoing or The Transcendent Kingdom, I highly recommend folks read those books. They're amazing. Elizabeth Strout, Olive Kitteridge,
mm.
all of Elizabeth Strout stuff's good, but Olive Kitteridge, I think, is probably one of the best books, at least one of my favorite books of the last 15 years.
Wow.
Yeah, and then Kazuo Ishiguro is a name that I don't think gets enough play. But
Yes.
The Remains of the Day is one of my favorite novels. He has just got such an amazing talent and elegance
Mm-hmm.
in his writing. His newest one, Claire and the Sun, was very good. Um, Never Let Me Go was a tremendous book. But so he's somebody I just feel like doesn't get enough.
Yeah.
Uh, and also along with that, I think Kent Haroff, if I'm pronouncing his name right, I've never
Mm.
quite known how to pronounce his name, but he's the one that wrote Plain Song and Eventide. And
Oh yeah.
um,
Mm-hmm.
his is a name that I already feel like I hear less and less,
Yeah.
since his passing, and that's a shame because those are books that really need to be widely read.
I have not read either of those, but I can definitely double down on the Ishiguro recommendation. And I always say that, like, if someone just explained the concept of the remains of the day to me, I would think, why would I ever open that book? That sounds
Yeah,
so boring.
yeah,
But it is astounding. It is an astounding book. What he is able to do just through dialogue and spare dialogue, and what he's able to, it's truly yeah, it's truly amazing. There's some writers that you just look at the page. I've made this analogy before, but, like, you watch athletics and you think an athlete at their prime, you watch them and you think, how are they doing what they're doing? There are
yeah.
some writers that I look at the page and I think, how are they doing what they're doing with words? And Ishiguro is one. David Foster Wallace is up there for me too. Like, just there's a genius to the craft that is beautiful to behold and also a little depressing because I will never,
Yeah,
I'll
yeah,
never
yeah.
get there. Yeah, but yeah.
I can
Anyways,
relate. I can relate to that for both reasons. Yeah.
yeah. Oh man. Well, this has been really fun. I genuinely appreciate your spirit in this conversation. It's been really, really fun connection for me. So thank you so much for taking the time to do it.
What a joy. I feel the same way, Joel. Thanks for inviting me.